Welcome everybody to this video introduction to Q-Cloud, a new way of running Q-Chem in the AWS Cloud. In this video, we will give you an overview of the architecture of Q-Cloud, go through the process of installing the software, and give a step-by-step guide on how to configure your cluster. By the end of this video, you'll be ready to launch your own Q-Cloud cluster, which will allow you to easily run Q-Chem jobs in the AWS Cloud. Setting up virtual clusters in the cloud can be a tricky business. Q-Cloud takes the hassle out of this process by automatically launching and configuring the resources that are required to manage user access, configure a scheduler, launch instances on demand, and shut down idle instances. Q-Cloud relies on several services provided by AWS. There are three main stacks that are launched when a cluster is started. The first stack is centered around Cognito. The Cognito service manages user access to the Q-Cloud cluster, and this access is independent of any AWS accounts. This allows users without AWS credentials to still access the cluster and run jobs. Users can be added via the Q-Cloud setup script, and their accounts exist independently of the head node. This means that if you shut down the compute cluster stack, the user accounts will persist, and these will only be lost if the Cognito stack itself is terminated. The second stack is centered around API Gateway. The API Gateway service provides an endpoint for the REST API. This allows jobs to be submitted to the cluster without having to log into the head node. Users are authenticated using Cognito, and once this has been done, the gateway transfers the job data to the head node to be submitted to the scheduler. Both Cognito and API Gateway are serverless. This means that there are no dedicated resources allocated to these stacks. If you're not accessing these services, there's virtually no charge associated with running these stacks. The third and final stack is the compute cluster itself. Q-Cloud automatically sets up a virtual private cloud, or VPC, to host the cluster. Within this VPC, two subnets are created. A public subnet that only contains the head node, and a private subnet that will contain the compute instances. The head node is a minimal T2 micro instance that runs the Slurm scheduler. This is the only part of the cluster that runs constantly. The compute instances are only launched on demand when there are jobs in the queue. When the queue clears, these compute instances are automatically terminated to avoid ongoing service charges. Although the head node exists in a public subnet, only the cluster administrator is able to log into this instance. All other user access is via the API Gateway. After a job is completed, the output is transferred to an S3 bucket for storage. Users can access the results in the bucket using the Q-Cloud command line interface, by providing the unique job key generated by the API Gateway when the job was submitted. The S3 bucket is independent of the cluster stack, meaning that if the cluster is shut down to save running costs, the results of completed jobs can still be accessed as long as Cognito and the API Gateway are running. Now let's look at the steps required to install the Q-Cloud software. Before setting up Q-Cloud, the cluster administrator will need to obtain an AWS access key that has administrator privileges. To obtain this, log into the AWS console with your root account and go to the Identity and Access Management, or IAM panel. This can always be found by searching for IAM in the search field and selecting the IAM service. You will need to create a user with administrator privileges. This user identity will be used to create the Q-Cloud admin user with reduced permissions required to run the Q-Cloud services. To do this, select the Users item from the left-hand panel. Click on the Create User button in the top right, give the user a name and click Next. Click on the Attach Policies Directly option and search for the Administrator Access policy. Attach this policy by clicking on the checkbox and the Next button. Review the new user details and click Create User in the bottom right. The new user will be created and appear in the user list. Select this user by clicking on the name. Make sure the Administrator Access Policy has been attached, and go to the Security Credentials panel. Scroll down to the Access Keys block and click Create Access Key. We will use this key from the command line interface, so select the first use case, confirm, and click Next. If desired, you can give the key a descriptive tag. Click Create Access Key. Make sure to copy both the access key and the secret access key. This is your only chance to view the secret access key, so if you don't copy it, you will need to create a new key from scratch. Click Done when you have copied the keys. Installing the Q-Cloud software was a breeze with the install tools provided. Download the install Q-Cloud script from the Q-Chem website. Add execute permissions to the script and run it. You'll be prompted to enter the access key and secret access key that you have just created. You will also need to enter a default AWS region name. If you're unsure, you can enter US East 1 or simply hit return to accept the default. Hit return again to accept the default output format. You'll be prompted for a directory name to install the files for the virtual environment. Enter a location or hit return to accept the suggested directory. The install tool will automatically download and configure a Python virtual environment that includes everything required to run the Q-Cloud software. As part of this installation, the Q-Cloud admin user will be created, and a custom IAM policy will be attached, which contains the necessary permissions to set up the Q-Cloud services. You will be prompted to make a choice of region where you wish to launch the cluster. Enter the number associated with your chosen region. The Q-Cloud environment has now been installed and configured. The configuration options are saved in a file in your home directory. You can view this file, but you shouldn't edit its contents. You are now able to configure your Q-Cloud cluster. Change into the Q-Cloud Virtual Environment directory and source the Activate file. Use the Q-Cloud Setup command and pass the -- configure option to enter the interactive prompts to configure the parameters for your cluster. You'll be asked which virtual private cluster to use. If this is the first time using Q-Cloud, you should create a new VPC, as this will automatically set up the required public and private subnets. Many of the steps required, such as obtaining an elastic IP address, are handled for you automatically. You will still need to select which instance type you want to use for your compute nodes. The maximum number of compute nodes should match that of the Q-Cloud license you have subscribed to. The scratch volume size should be large enough for the type of jobs you want to run, but be aware that creating large volumes will attract higher storage charges from AWS. The job output volume will store only the output files generated by the calculations, and this does not have to be large. A cluster configuration file will be generated in the working directory. You can review this file before actually launching your cluster. If you're unsatisfied with any of your selections, you can rerun the Q-Cloud Setup command with the configure option. To launch the cluster, simply pass the -- launch option to the Q-Cloud Setup command whilst the virtual environment is active and you're in the same directory as the configuration file generated in the previous step. Q-Cloud will launch and configure the necessary resources for the cluster based on the configuration file contents. These stacks take time to launch, and the cluster stack in particular will take several minutes, so be patient. Once the cluster has finished launching, the Elastic IP address will be displayed. You will need to send this IP address along with your order number to Q-Chem in order to get an activation code for your license. Once you have obtained your activation key, you can install it on the head node with the -- activation key option to the Q-Cloud setup script. If your license activation has been successful, you'll see the Q-Chem licensing service will be active. Your cluster is now up and running, but before you can submit any Q-Chem jobs, you will need to create a user account. Use the -- add user option and provide the username as an argument. You should also specify the user's email address with the -- email option. The user will receive an email with a temporary password to access the Q-Cloud server. You will also need to separately provide them with the details of the Q-Cloud cluster given by the user info option. In order for your user to use the Q-Cloud cluster, they will need to install the Q-Cloud user Python package. They can configure the cluster by passing the -- configure option to the Q-Cloud command. The details obtained from the user info option will need to be entered, and these are saved in the Q-Cloud client configuration file in their home directory. You are now ready to submit jobs to your Q-Cloud cluster and harness the power of the AWS cloud for your Q-Chem calculations.